Welcome. In this clip, we'll be finishing up a series of videos on early modern philosophy by looking at a really interesting essay by Kant known as What is Enlightenment? Now, this essay will in many ways serve as an opportunity to maybe reflect on some of the epistemic values that have been sometimes in the foreground and sometimes in the background in the story of early modern philosophy. So here's the plan. We will talk about this saying, sapere aude, that is, dare to know, this famous claim and sort of the guiding principle behind what Kant is in favor of in this essay. We'll focus in on maybe one of the more difficult parts of the essay, where Kant talks about the difference between the private and public use of reason, and then I'll flag some general conclusions from what we might take away from this really interesting and important essay by Kant. So, what is enlightenment? That's a really interesting question, and maybe an important one in the context of reading a bunch of philosophy that's often referred to as Enlightenment philosophy. So here's part of how Kant thinks about it. We have this advice, this command that we find in ourselves and in our times, which is that we must dare to know, right? We must be seekers of the truth. And in this way, Kant tells us that when we are seeking enlightenment, when we are living in the Enlightenment age, what he is suggesting is that it is emergence from one's self-imposed nonage. Now, this word nonage is sort of a fancy way of talking about somebody as a partial citizen due to the fact that they are a minor, right? So somebody who is of a level of immaturity that makes them less than a full citizen. So nonage is this inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. And in this way, we think of the person in a state of nonage as a person who needs to be looked after, maybe with a certain amount of paternalistic care. He says, those who set themselves up as the guardians of others, that is, the intellectual guardians of others, who have kindly taken supervision among themselves to see to it that the overwhelming majority of mankind, among them the entire fair sex, should consider the step to maturity not only as hard, but extremely dangerous. So what's Kant saying here? He's saying that in many cases, people will set themselves up as authorities to do the thinking for certain people in society so they don't have to. In this way, he's pointing out that in an age where we find ourselves unenlightened, what we often find is that we say, well, I don't have to think about these questions because my priest will think about them for me, or because my professors will think about them for me. It's not up to me to think for myself. Now, that attitude is a failure of daring to know. That's to be an intellectual child rather than what Kant is advocating for, which is to be, as we might put it, an intellectual grown-up. And one thing that we might notice, and this is what Kant notices, is that in society it's often found that to think for yourself is treated as both difficult and dangerous. So that is sometimes the message that people are given, that, well, you shouldn't bother trying to work out questions of, say, religion or science for yourself, because those questions are ones that you'd be much better off to leave to somebody else. Now, Kant does argue that, in fact, these sorts of worries are quite overblown. But in this context, we can sort of see the way in which the Enlightenment process is having courage and doing the hard thing in trying to get an understanding of the world for yourself rather than leaving the thinking to somebody else. Now, he says one important way that we can become enlightened, that we can become intellectual grown-ups, is through the exercise of what Kant calls the public use of reason. And in this way, he's going to say, giving people the opportunity to think for themselves is going to require freedom, especially in the sense, he says, there's no way that we can become enlightened if people don't have the opportunity to make public use of their reason. Now, as he puts it, when we're talking about public use of reason, he's saying this is to reason and argue as a scholar to the reading public. So when we're talking about making scholarly arguments, he's saying that this is bringing yourself into a practice of having the intellectual courage to argue for a particular point of view and to do it in a community of other learners who are trying to work things out for themselves. That would be our reading public, right? He says, if you want to become enlightened, you have to become a scholar of your own, as it were. But this is a really interesting point that Kant gives us. He's going to say, just because we need unlimited public reason, he says, that doesn't mean that we need complete private use of reason as well. So he says, maybe we do not need, in an enlightened age, to reason and argue within a civic post. And here he points out, we need to restrict private use of reason in order to produce artificial unanimity, which will serve public fulfillment of public objectives. Now, we need to get clear on this notion of the private use of reason. Here would be one example of reasoning and arguing within a civic post. We might, for instance, have somebody who works within the field of policing who also believes that it's unjust to punish people for a certain crime, right? They might, for instance, believe that certain drug laws are unjust. Now, it's important to note that it's okay to personally disagree with maybe a particular law, but if your job is to carry out law enforcement, it's not your job. And in fact, it's counterproductive to society, Kant seems to think, to argue against these laws that you find problematic. Right? The other really good example that Kant gives is you might have an issue with taxes from a philosophical point of view. So for instance, you might think that it's wrong for the government to charge people taxes. You can argue for that claim as a public scholar, right? But what you can't do is think that because you have a personal argument against paying taxes, that you are allowed to exempt yourself from your civic responsibilities of paying them. Another example we might give, there are some people who are teachers, myself included, who have certain qualms about how certain systems of grading are done. That maybe giving students A's and A pluses and A minuses is actually counterproductive to certain goals of learning, and it would be maybe even a better thing to simply count students as satisfactory or unsatisfactory, or having learned certain things or having not, but worrying less about grades. Now, it might be the case that I might have some concerns about how grading is done nowadays, but when I grade my students' papers and when I enter final grades at the end of the semester, ultimately I have to check those concerns at the door in order to fulfill certain public objectives, like giving students grades for transcripts that they can then use for certain applications and transcripts and so forth. So that's one example of where public use of reason might give me total freedom to speak my views, but my private use of reason might be somewhat limited. So yeah, taxation would be another good example. But even if you have philosophical objections to taxation, you might also still have certain obligations to pay tax laws. Now, a last sort of case that Kant ends up reflecting on a great deal in the essay involves religious matters. Within certain religions, you might have public use of reason that might, as a member of clergy, point you in one direction, but it might be that when you are in a civic post, you need to stick with official church doctrine. But ultimately, Kant is going to say official church doctrine can't be so restrictive that people have to check their reason at the door completely. That we need to leave room for everybody to think things through and understand for themselves if we're going to respect human dignity and autonomy, ultimately. So here's a last thing to reflect on. Kant says when we ask, are we living in an enlightened age? He actually says the answer is no. But we live in an age of enlightenment. Here's a reflection on maybe what Kant means. He says it's not fully the case that people can think for themselves. It wasn't true at the end of the 1700s when he wrote this essay. But he is also saying that maybe nowadays we're becoming a little freer to speak our minds, to argue and reason as scholars than we once were. Kant found it to be a welcome thing that the public use of reason for scholars was something that he felt was protected at his time in the late 18th century in Prussia. So we might say that enlightenment is maybe a goal that we aim to achieve, although it hasn't been fully achieved, according to Kant. We might even point out it might even be true nowadays. Does everybody have the freedom to think and argue and reason as a scholar might? To some extent. But we might also notice that some people will not dare to think for themselves, and there are other people who will set themselves up as the guardians of others, intellectually speaking, who will try to do the thinking for them. But we might then ask, is the process of enlightenment still undergoing? We might ask what we might still be hopeful about in order to think of how maybe further enlightenment, further intellectual autonomy might be advanced. And we might also think about certain things that we might be pessimistic about. Are there certain factors in our society that make people less likely to do the hard work of thinking for themselves? From here, I will leave it to you to reflect further and to also think about how, within the context of the history of early modern philosophy, we see certain steps and attempts at maybe striving towards this thing that Kant calls enlightenment. That is, as he puts it, emerging from our self-imposed nonage. But with that, and my leaving you to reflect, I'll thank you for listening in, and we'll leave things there. Take care.